Billionaire Alexander Langford's $200 million super yacht sat crippled, paralyzing the harbor. Highly paid engineers failed to solve the crisis for hours. Langford, furious. 100 experts, and no one can fix my vessel? Evan Ross, a worn-out single father, walked past with his daughter. Noticing Evan glance at the engine, Alexander snapped, "Hey, poor man, if you're so smart, you fix it." The crowd sneered. A penniless mechanic fixing this yacht? What a joke. Alexander smirked. "Succeed? I'll pay double your wildest dream." Evan replied quietly, "I don't need your money, sir. I just need to prove a point." Evan stepped onto the deck, his daughter whispering, "You can do it, Dad." Alexander challenged, "Show me, smart pauper." Evan Ross, 34 years old, lived a life stripped down to the essentials, his daughter and his work. He was a single father, residing in the decaying quarters of the Harbor District, a forgotten man since his wife succumbed to a prolonged, costly illness 3 years prior. The medical bills had systematically destroyed his savings and forced the sale of everything they owned, including his chief engineer license and his highly profitable consulting business. His grief was a quiet companion, replaced by the relentless, grinding drive of survival. His primary trade was manual mechanics, a highly skilled profession, but one desperately undervalued in a world of clean, digital diagnostics. He fixed old engines, generators, water pumps, anything that sputtered, seized, or failed, anything that could put food on Emma's plate. Evan possessed no prestigious modern degree. He held only the ancient, coveted Master Marine certification, earned through years of perilous duty at sea, but those papers were now hidden in a dusty box. His true education came from the unforgiving, brutal school of hands-on experience, primarily gained during his tenure as a chief mechanic on offshore marine construction sites years ago. He had spent years deep inside the churning, overheated bowels of massive ships, solving problems that no textbook, and certainly no current engineer, could address. This raw, practical, and highly dangerous knowledge was his only real asset. His schedule was punishingly precise. He woke at 4 a.m. to prepare Emma's breakfast, carefully walking her to school, often watching the Langford buses ferry wealthier children in luxury. He then raced off to piece together a series of low-paying, hourly repair jobs, often working until midnight. He had to decline any job that required extensive travel or long hours away, prioritizing the few precious hours he had to read to Emma before bedtime. Emma, his sensitive and fiercely loyal 8-year-old, was his world. She never wavered in her faith in him, even when the landlord was knocking or their dinner consisted only of rice and beans. "Dad is the smartest person I know," she would often declare to anyone who would listen, her small chest swelling with pride. The outside world, however, saw only his faded jacket and scuffed boots. Their labels were harsh. His neighbors called him the poor mechanic, the lowly repairman. The local dock workers treated him with patronizing pity. The Langford security guards in particular viewed him as an inevitable drain on society, a necessary nuisance to be kept at arm's length from wealth. Evan never argued. He simply lowered his head and absorbed the judgment, his silence a protective shield for his daughter. He knew the cost of his choice. He had chosen fatherhood over financial recovery, and he would pay that price every day without complaint. He often passed by the Langford Corporation docks. It was a daily route of contrasts, walking past gleaming yachts and the arrogantly posed teams of Langford engineers. These specialists, in their crisp, monogrammed uniforms, frequently saw Evan as an unwelcome intrusion. "This area is not for the poor," they would sneer, waving him away from their pristine equipment. They used diagnostic computers the size of lunchboxes and relied on satellite feedback. They wouldn't understand a single grease stain on their hands. Alexander Langford himself was the embodiment of this corporate arrogance. The billionaire, whose empire was built on a fleet of luxury vessels, was known for his short temper, his demanding nature, and his intense disdain for common people who didn't know their place. He prized academic credentials and wealth, viewing manual labor as a mark of failure and desperation. Today, Evan hadn't stopped to stare. He had stopped to observe. The yacht's problem was immediately familiar to him. He recognized the distinct, uneven rumble of the engine's struggle, the same telltale signature he'd encountered years ago on a decommissioned offshore vessel. He knew the source of the mechanical distress. Emma, seeing her father's focused gaze, tugged his hand gently. Dad, you should help them. They look really stuck. Evan let out a heavy sigh, a sound of profound resignation. No one here trusts a man like me, my love. They only see what they want to see, a failure. But Alexander Langford, standing yards away, overheard the exchange. He scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. You are telling us you know what we missed? If you're so wise, step up and fix my yacht. The challenge was the joke, a way to further humiliate his frustrated team and the poor man simultaneously. Evan's eyes narrowed as he focused on the yacht's hull. He could visually trace the structure from the outside, mentally mapping the complex maze of the fuel filtration system. He knew instinctively that the engineers were attempting to solve a modern problem with a legacy engine. He remembered vividly an incident at his old marine site. This exact model of engine, the precursor to the current commercial line, had a critical, almost fatal design flaw in its fuel return line. It was a failure that had nearly killed his coworker, a horrific memory of fire and steam. Evan was the only one on that site who had known the obsolete modification required to bypass the catastrophic failure. That memory, sharp and cold, hardened his resolve. He looked up at the arrogant billionaire. He had something to prove, not for himself, but for his daughter. He stepped forward. The moment Evan Ross stepped onto the pristine teak deck, the elite engineering team erupted in scorn. It was a vicious, protective reaction to the threat he represented to their credentials. "This is a joke, right?" one senior engineer shouted, his face red with indignation. "He's a street mechanic. Mr. Langford is making us look ridiculous. He doesn't even have a digital diagnostic tablet." Another chimed in with biting sarcasm. "This engine needs a specialist with a PhD in propulsion dynamics, not a guy who fixes dishwashers on the side. Our diagnostic reports show no failures in the primary loop." Alexander Langford stood back, his arms still crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "I want to see your miracle, Mr. Ross, but make it fast. My time is precious." The atmosphere was thick with contempt, a collective sneer directed at Evan's poverty. Evan ignored them all. He moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency. He didn't rush to the modern control panel or the sleek diagnostics box the team had been staring at. Instead, he dropped to his knees, his worn-out body instinctively seeking the problem's physical core. Emma stayed right behind him, her small hand trembling slightly as she watched the hostile crowd. Suddenly, a technician aggressively shoved Emma aside. "Move it, kid! You're dripping water on the control cables. This isn't a playground. You'll contaminate the equipment." Evan straightened instantly, his whole demeanor changing from quiet mechanic to protective father. His voice, usually soft, cracked like a whip across the dock. "Do not touch my daughter, ever!" The engineers burst into cruel laughter, pointing. "Look at him. The poor man has pride. What an absolute clown, bringing his baggage to $1 billion problem." Their mockery was cruel, a collective defense mechanism against their own inadequacy, an attempt to assert their supposed superiority. Evan turned back to the machinery, his focus absolute. He bypassed the main injection unit and the primary filters, which the team had repeatedly checked. He traced the low-pressure auxiliary fuel return pipe with his eyes, a route ignored by the modern diagnostic system. 10 seconds of observation, and his face transformed. The fatigue was replaced by a cold, alarming certainty. He stood up, looking directly at the senior engineer who had laughed the loudest. "If you attempt to start this engine one more time, with the current back pressure showing on the manifold, it will overheat the fuel rail and burn out the main combustion chamber in under 3 minutes. It's not a malfunction. It's an impending critical system failure." The engineer sneered, pointing at a flawless readout on his tablet. "We have 3 separate system monitors confirming that the primary loop pressure is within nominal parameters. We are top university specialists. Who the hell are you to lecture us about engine thermodynamics?" Evan's reply was delivered with terrifying calm, his eyes fixed on the man. "I am a man who watched this exact engine type tear itself apart in front of him. Your digital monitors are measuring the wrong pump. You have a fatal clog in the obsolete secondary loop." Alexander Langford shifted, his impatience warring with a sliver of professional doubt. "Let's talk, Ross. This is my vessel, not a history lesson. Fix it or get out." Evan issued his first command, sharp and clear. I need the high-pressure relief valve on the auxiliary feed disconnected immediately. You'll see the pressure surge that proves my point. The lead specialist protested vehemently, waving his hands. Absolutely not. That violates every standard operational procedure. We cannot depressurize the main line when the vessel is primed. We could introduce cavitation. Evans shot back, his eyes unwavering. The procedure you are following is for the current-gen Ocean Master 7.0 quote engine. This vessel uses the predecessor, the Sea Serpent 6.2B model. That version was quietly recalled due to a critical flow restriction caused by using a polymer filter in the fuel return line. The manufacturer told owners to bypass it. You missed the service bulletin. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a paralyzing silence. The engineering team looked at each other, their faces pale. Recalled models were often wiped from official training manuals, deemed irrelevant. They realized they had been relying on protocols that were fatally wrong for this specific legacy unit. One stunned engineer finally managed to stammer, horror in his voice. How? How could you possibly know about the 6.2B's polymer filter issue? That information is classified to maintenance directors only. Evan didn't break his focus. I was the maintenance director. I worked the Southern International Marine Site when the 6.2B failed the safety audit. I repaired this exact unit every single day until they replaced it. I know its faults better than your manuals, and certainly better than your diagnostic readouts. Alexander Langford's arrogant posture stiffened, his internal alarm bells ringing. The claim was too specific, too technical to be a bluff. He fought to maintain his tyrannical composure. If you are correct, prove it now. The liability is on your head. Evan worked alone. He called for no assistance, knowing the danger of what he was about to do. He manually turned a high-torque valve, pushed an air hose into a deeply buried chamber, and carefully began to dismantle a section of the machine that the engineers had previously labeled inaccessible and too dangerous to touch. The tension was suffocating. The risk of a flash fire was immediate. Emma, watching her father risk everything in the face of such danger, tears welled in her eyes. It was not fear of the explosion, but fear for the sheer physical exertion and the burden placed upon him. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Evan wrenched out a single component from the auxiliary return housing. It was the secondary fuel filter, utterly blackened, clogged with sediment, and completely seized, a legacy part no one in the modern crew had thought to check because it was part of the obsolete, flawed design loop. It looked like a lump of tar. Evan held the choke filter up for the entire crowd to see, his worn hands contrasting starkly with the greasy metal. His voice cut through the silence, powerful and final. This, he announced, is the polymer filter. It failed the moment the engine started its first cold cycle this morning. This is why your multi-million-dollar super yacht was about to explode. The deck was dead silent. The truth, stark and undeniable, hung in the air like the metallic smell of diesel. A senior engineer, the one who had mocked Evan's lack of a degree, scrambled forward, snatching the filter from Evan's hand. He ran his thumb over the tar-like sediment. His expression cycled from disbelief to horror, then to profound shame. He slammed the part down on a nearby workbench. My God, he's absolutely right. The return line is completely clogged. We focused on the high-pressure side because the protocols told us to. The auxiliary pressure reading was nominal, but that was because the clog was so bad, no fuel could get through to drop the pressure. The crowd murmured, their denial quickly shifting to shocked, professional realization. How did we miss that? Impossible. It wasn't in the software report. Alexander Langford stood rooted, the shock of being publicly wrong and facing a $200 million catastrophe visible on his face. He swallowed hard. Continue, Ross. Do whatever you need to do. Evan returned to work, his movement transitioning from diagnosis to surgical precision. This was the complex, dangerous part. He systematically cleaned the C's filter using a low-pressure sonic wash he quickly rigged up from a nearby water pump in a simple emulsifier. Traced and hydro-cleared the connected fuel lines, which were partially solidified with old fuel residue. Adjusted the auxiliary bypass valve to permanently and physically isolate the obsolete filter housing, ensuring the system would never fail in this way again. realign the tiny impeller blade on the small jet thruster that was under strain due to the power fluctuation. He used only a micrometer and a small wrench, demonstrating a mastery of precision manual labor that digital systems could never replicate. A junior engineer approached Evan, his tone now one of deep, almost desperate respect. You didn't use a single diagnostic tool. How did you know the flow was restricted down to the micron level just by listening? Evan didn't look up. The sound told me everything. The 6.2B doesn't knock when it starves. It sings a high-pitched hum as the fuel pump tries to compensate. It's a signature sound, son, from the actual job, not from a textbook. Alexander Langford watched every single motion. His face transitioned entirely, shifting from pure arrogance to stunned astonishment, then to grudging respect. This was not repair. This was a performance of mechanical genius, a man who understood the machine better than its own creators. 30 minutes later, Evan quietly secured the last clamp. He straightened up, wiping the thick grime from his hands into his worn trousers. He looked utterly exhausted but satisfied. He walked to the control panel, bypassing the co-pilot. He hit the start sequence himself. "Start it," he said simply. The entire team held their collective breath. The co-pilot, hesitant, watched. The engine roared to life, not with a sputtering cough, but with a deep, steady, smooth hum, purring like a brand new machine. The vibration was perfect, the sound's signature flawless. The dock erupted in chaos. He did it! Unbelievable! It's running perfectly. A poor mechanic saved the billionaire's yacht. The shame! Alexander Langford stood rooted to the spot, finally accepting what had just transpired. His pride was shattered, but his vessel was whole. The engineers who had mocked Evan now stood with bowed heads, their expensive certifications feeling utterly meaningless. The senior engineer approached, his voice barely a whisper of shame. I deeply apologize, Mr. Ross. You are truly brilliant. We were arrogant fools." Evan only looked back at Emma. "Were you scared, my girl?" Emma ran to him, hugging his waist tightly. "I knew you could do it, Super Dad. I knew you were smarter than all of them." Alexander finally walked over, his voice devoid of its usual tyrannical edge, replaced by genuine, heavy admiration. "I misjudged you, Ross, profoundly and deeply. You have my gratitude." "It's fine, sir," Evan replied wearily. "I'm used to it. People see what they want to see." Another engineer, hopeful and clearly chastened, stepped in. "Mr. Ross, would you consider joining our team? We need your real-world experience, your skill." Before Evan could answer, Alexander's voice, now restored to a powerful roar, but this time a roar of desire, cut him off. "Silence! He works for me. Now, I will triple your offer." But Evan shook his head, looking the billionaire directly in the eye. "I don't work for anyone, Mr. Langford. I set my own hours." Alexander frowned, his ego stinging. "What? Name your price. I will pay you 50 times what you make now. I'll buy you a house." Evan shook his head again. "I need time, sir. I have a small child. I don't chase money, I chase moments with her." Alexander let out a short, hollow laugh. "You refuse me? The most powerful man on this dock? For a child?" Evan knelt and embraced Emma. "She is the reason I left my career, sir. She is the only reason I do anything at all." The crowd watched, moved by the pure, unadulterated devotion. Emma, sensing the emotional gravity, held up a crumpled drawing, a crayon sketch of her dad, standing proudly next to a massive boat labeled simply, "Super Daddy." Alexander stared at the drawing, then back at Evan. His aggressive facade cracked entirely. He took a long, hard breath, then asked the single question that silenced the whole harbor. "You are not just a simple mechanic, are you, Ross? That was not the work of a man who just fixes broken generators." Evan sighed, the weight of his hidden history finally lifting. He stood tall, the scruffiness of his clothes no longer hiding the man beneath. "I was the chief international marine engineer for South Pacific shipyards, directly overseeing 70 mechanics in a full facility. I was responsible for the entire fleet's safety compliance. I walked away when my wife passed away. I needed to be my daughter's full-time carer. No job was worth sacrificing her childhood." The entire harbor was stunned into absolute silence. The man they had mocked was not a lowly technician. He was a master, a commander who had traded a massive, high-paying career for the small hand of his daughter. Alexander Langford looked at Evan as if seeing him, truly seeing him, for the very first time. He finally understood the depth of the sacrifice. Following the dramatic repair and the stunning reveal, Alexander Langford did the unthinkable. He dismissed his entire shamed engineering team for the evening and invited Evan and Emma onto the super yacht for a private dinner. The engineers watched in bewildered silence as the man they had scorned walked up the gangplank as the billionaire's personal, revered guest. Emma was mesmerized. She ran around the deck, pointing at the setting sun over the ocean, peppering Evan with excited questions about the sea and the yacht's inner workings. Evan indulged her, answering every question with a warm, easy smile, the tension from the ordeal finally melting away. Alexander sat opposite them at the massive table, quieter and more subdued than anyone had ever seen him. He simply watched Evan interact with his daughter, noticing the effortless connection they shared. "I have never witnessed engine repair like that," Alexander finally admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "No reliance on computers, no talk of money, no fear of dirt. Just pure, innate, brilliant knowledge." Evan responded, his voice soft. "I simply did what I knew had to be done." The vessel was in immediate danger. A moment of heavy silence passed before Alexander unexpectedly opened up, a rare sign of vulnerability. "I inherited my company from my father. My entire life has been built on layers of protection and privilege. I've never had to fight for anything real." "You are different, Ross. You fought for survival." Evan smiled faintly. "I don't fight for myself, Mr. Langford. I fought for my daughter. That makes the stakes infinitely higher." Emma, fully relaxed now, suddenly chimed in with a sweet, profound innocence, wanting to show off her father. "And Dad can fix things bigger than a super yacht, too. Even my toys." Alexander's stern expression softened into a rare, genuine laugh. "Bigger? What could possibly be bigger than this behemoth of a vessel?" Emma looked at him with serious, wise eyes. "My broken heart, sir. Since Mommy left, my dad fixes it every single night by holding me while I sleep." The entire cabin went silent. It was a moment of pure, raw, and undeniable emotional truth that disarmed the billionaire completely. Alexander looked at Evan for a long, reflective moment. He saw not the poor man, not the mechanic, but the profound strength of the father. He realized that all his money and power had never provided him with the level of respect, love, and purpose Evan commanded. He saw a man who had willingly given up everything he had worked for to fulfill his most sacred duty. In the final quiet moment of the act, Alexander spoke softly, his voice heavy with regret and admiration, addressing Evan as an equal for the first time. "You sacrificed everything. If I possessed half the heart you have, Ross, I might not be quite so isolated and alone now." The apology was unspoken but clear. His arrogance was a shield against his own emptiness. Evan nodded gently, a shared understanding passing between the two men, one wealthy beyond measure, the other rich in the only currency that truly mattered. The healing had begun, not just for the yacht, but for the billionaire's view of the world and his own empty life. The next morning, the Langford Corporation felt different. Alexander Langford, a man known for his ruthless pragmatism, was executing a decision of unexpected emotional depth. He summoned Evan to his corporate office. Hundreds of employees lined the glass hallways, their heads bowed in respect and awe. Evan's repair video, filmed secretly by a dock worker, had gone massively viral overnight. He was now the harbor hero. Alexander stood at the head of the boardroom, a place of immense power, but today he deferred to Evan. He introduced Evan not as a hire but as an invited equal. "Effective immediately," Alexander announced to the silent room, his voice carrying the weight of authority and newfound humility. "Evan Ross is appointed as the senior technical consultant for the entire Langford fleet. His role is to prevent catastrophic failures, not just fix them. His schedule is entirely his own. He dictates his hours, his workload, and his compensation." The room erupted in applause. This was not a job offer. It was a partnership. Evan walked to the podium, his posture strong, his voice calm. "I accept the position on one condition," he stated clearly. "I must be able to bring my daughter to work with me whenever she needs to be close. My first priority is Emma." Alexander laughed heartily, a genuine, joyful sound that echoed through the otherwise sterile room. That, Mr. Ross, is the easiest condition I have ever heard. We'll build her a custom playroom in the executive suite. Emma, who had been waiting patiently, ran to the stage, wrapping her arms around her father's legs. "The best dad in the world," she cheered, and the staff cheered with her. A reporter in the back, invited for the press conference, asked, "Mr. Ross, the rumor is you turned down a massive salary offer. Why did you only ask for time?" Evan smiled, looking at his daughter, whose future was now secure. "I asked for time. Time is the only thing money cannot buy, and it is the only thing I cannot risk losing with her." Alexander looked at Emma, then back at Evan, and delivered the final, life-changing statement that sealed their bond and brought tears to Evan's eyes. "And if she needs it," the billionaire stated, his voice ringing with sincerity, "I can be her education sponsor. Tuition, books, accommodation, university, until she has achieved every dream she holds. A gift of respect, not payment." Evan could not speak. He simply stepped down from the podium and pulled Emma into a tight embrace, the years of silent struggle finally validating his sacrifice. The price of saving the yacht wasn't a paycheck. It was the promise of his daughter's future security, delivered by the man who had once been his tormentor. The closing scene showed the three of them, Alexander, Evan, and Emma, walking out onto the dock together. The morning sun glinted off the water, marking the beginning of a new chapter for all three. Evan, walking side by side with the man who had once tried to humiliate him, no longer needed to hide his worth. He was still Evan the father, but now he was also Evan the master engineer, a man respected, acknowledged, and finally financially secure, all because he chose love over pride. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to NL Touching Stories.